freaking off the charts, ADHD. So it's very information overload is something I'm very well acquainted with, and missing fine details is something that I'm also well acquainted with. So to answer the first question, why I wrote the book, first of all, just a little background on me. I started business coaching in 1998. I am an entrepreneur. I was raised by entrepreneurs. And interestingly, I think coming from a family like that, I just saw that there was a pattern of a lot of failure, honestly, in running and owning a small business. And that was what cultivated my interest in this topic. So I'm coming from the perspective of an entrepreneur, perhaps a little less academic, more school of hard knocks, so to speak. And it was through my experience in working with my clients, with so many small business owners, that I saw a pattern of multitasking, in particular with small business owners, because they as a group have not just one job description. It's not as if they're a sales executive or a manager with some employees. Typically, they're the manager, the salesperson, the marketer, the visionary. I mean, I could just list on and on. We could get up to 10 to 20 different job descriptions. So by nature of their job description, they have the tendency to have many, many different switches. And that's the term that I use. I know Jonathan uses the term interruptions. It's the same thing. And every time you make a switch, there's a switching cost involved. So really, when I decided to write the book, The Myth of Multitasking, it was very, very easy for me to write it because all I did was just take the combined stories of my clients and combine it into one book. One thing that's unique about my book is that it's written in a story format. A lot of people call it a business fable, but really it's just a story about a consultant helping a business and helping the business owner and the people around them stop this habit of multitasking and all the costs that come involved with that. So that's why I wrote the book, was really, first of all, because I saw the need, and second of all, because at the point at which I was at, working for years with clients, it was just darn easy for me to write the book based on the experiences that I had. So to answer the second question, the issues and the solution, one of the things that my book talks about is switch tasking. That what multitasking really is, when people think they're multitasking, what they're really doing is switch tasking. They're switching back and forth rapidly, sometimes within a matter of seconds, between different activities. So there are three different places that I start with my clients, and I think for most people, whether or not you're a business owner, they're very relevant. The first thing that I work on with my clients is help them draw a line in the sand. What that means is that there is a clear stopping point in your work schedule each day, that there's a begin time and an end time, and you don't cross that line. So many CEOs and business owners that I work with have the mentality that they will work as long as it takes to get the job done. And when you have that perspective of working as long as it takes, guess what? You do work as long as it takes to get the job done. It causes you to actually be very lazy in a productivity sense because you're allowing yourself to be assaulted by all the different things that happen in the day. But if you have a boundary line in your day that says, I'm not going to work past 6 p.m., it forces you to start thinking systemically about your day. You start thinking about, how can I protect my time? How can I make wiser decisions about what I'm doing with my time? So that's the first place that I recommend people start, is to create that line in the sand. The second thing that I deal with my clients is helping them avoid what I call dam failure. And when I say dam, that's D-A-M. Your time is like a reservoir. And if you think about it, protected by a dam, there's a limit to how far you can fill that up. And when you start to add more things to your schedule, more businesses, more opportunities, more activities, it starts to overflow. You keep that up over a long period of time, and pretty soon you have dam failure, which is when things just overwhelm you. So it's really about making choices, and the most important word to learn when it comes to avoiding this is no. You need to learn how to say no to not just the small things, but the big things, the big opportunities. Because for people right now, there are so many different opportunities, and you can only choose to be involved in one or two of them. And then the last one, really quickly, is stopping what I call the dreaded double queue. And the dreaded double queue goes like this. You'll be in your office, someone comes, knocks on the door, and says, "Excuse me, I've got just a quick question." Those little quick questions, as Jonathan is an expert in, have huge costs involved with them. Even if the question takes 30 seconds, it can take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to recover from answering that question. So one of the things that we do is, that I help my clients do, is we implement one-to-one meetings. We have a regular one-to-one meeting schedule. What that means is that all of these quick questions are held off until a set time and a set place where you're meeting on a recurring schedule with your subordinates, or even with people that manage you, and then you are queuing all those questions to that point. That's not to say that emergencies aren't going to happen, but the majority of the things that happen in the workplace aren't emergencies, or would not become emergencies if there was a regular schedule. So those are just three quick things that points of action that you can take away from what I work with on my clients and what I share in my book.
Great. Well, Dave, thank you so very much. I appreciate it. We're now going to move on to Daniel Forrester, author of Consider. Daniel, the microphone is yours.
Hello, Mr. Spira. How are you?
Thank you for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
Call me Jonathan.
Hello, everyone out there, and I appreciate this entire conversation, and really pleased to be joined by so many colleagues who I think are looking at a big problem from many different angles.
I'm just going to ask you to speak a drop louder. You're coming in a drop low.
No problem. How's that? Is that a little better?
Slightly.
Let me see if I can get turned up a little bit. I'll just come closer. How's that?
Much better. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to the first question, which is sort of the origins of writing my book, which is called Consider, Harnessing the Power of Reflective Thinking in Your Organization. And the origin really was sort of three things. One, kind of going back all the way to 2005, and an article that I read in the Wall Street Journal about Bill Gates' Think Weeks, which these celebrated weeks that he still participates in as a philanthropist. And a writer by the name of Rob Guth wrote the article, and it really grabbed my attention for a few reasons. One, the big ideas that Bill Gates was trying to shape in his tenure during Microsoft's time. And two, why it was that someone who is such an iconic leader and figure in the world would be so hard-pressed to find time at the office in which to think about big ideas. You would have imagined that Bill Gates, or at least I did, would be able to structure his day in such a way that information would be flowing to him, and not only would he be in decision-making mode, but he could also be in thinking mode. And so that whole just behavior of his, where twice a year he would go off into the mountainside, which apparently, in the context about how he's giving away his billions now, he still does, it just captivated me, and it made me wonder why a leader like that behaves the way he does. And it had lots of positive impacts for Microsoft, but it also, to me, I think helped to symbolize perhaps how Microsoft had outgrown him or any one person who could lead a company that big, and what it means to be a leader at the top of an organization starving for time to think. Clearly, all of us suffer from this wave of information overload, but I think the senior-most leaders in organizations today have it at a level that is beyond anything that the average knowledge worker has. And I spent almost 2 years of my life studying habits of people like David Crenshaw and others, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So that was sort of the origin. Number one was just my consciousness of what think time was to a big leader. The second reason why I wrote the book was my personal behaviors with regards to coming to grips with the concept of multitasking. Multitasking, if you just do a Google and search it on job descriptions, it is still featured in some of the great companies of our day, and I'm not going to single out any single company that is listed out there. But on almost every job description for a knowledge worker, you put in there the idea that they should be able to, and I think what people are getting at is to be able to do simultaneous tasks or to move lots of different projects along. But I don't think we make a big enough distinction the way that Mr. Crenshaw just did and others, and really come to grips at an individual level with what multitasking is and whether or not I, as an individual, am capable of it. And so I question that. When things happen to me that I don't understand, when planes fly into buildings and we learn words like Al-Qaeda, I go pretty deep on those things and try to get to understand it. And when I realized what was happening to me in terms of my own behaviors, I just said, is it possible? Is multitasking possible? And once you dig in on the research, it is overwhelming what comes back to you, that when you look at functional MRI exams that are being done out in California, or every single study that has yet to be out there, although I did find one that had this notion of what was called supertaskers, I believe it was University of Idaho, said that 2% of us are capable of doing simultaneous technology-driven tasks with the same efficacy. I quickly realized that I was in the 98th percentile, that I was one of the average, and that my ability to be effective as a leader, I work with clients like the Library of Congress, the National Cathedral, AARP, and I'm in front of very senior executives helping them to reshape big ideas in their future, that I was being ineffective because multitasking was a mythology, and I had to come to grips with it. And that's something that I think is a big sort of turning point, and something that I talk a lot about in my book, is just coming to the punchline of whether or not you believe that. Because I think there is still a hard resistance to the idea that with all this technology and all this connectivity, of course we can do it all, and it can all come at us at the same time, and we can do it with the same efficacy. In fact, the opposite is true, and we all know, you're going to hear a lot more about that from the other panelists today, that we suffer when we try to do that. When you talk to folks like Jonathan Spira and you learn concepts like interruption and the recovery time notion, or was just being discussed, the switching costs, it made me personally change one very distinct behavior. I think in my own company of Sapient, there are 10,000 employees. I would argue I'm the only one not on instant messaging, because it was fragmenting my day and making me work on other people's agendas, which, so I've taken it off the radar. And there's many ways you can get to me, but instant messaging is one of them. The last thing that I wanted to do in writing this book was not to lament the problem of information overload so much, and really what does it mean to have no time to think anymore, because we don't. And Jonathan's research also shows us that not only do we have a ridiculous amount of time that we spend recovering from interruptions, but think time, literally, time to think and reflect, I've described it in front of audiences as on life support. When I first met Jonathan, the number was about 10 to 11% of a knowledge worker's day. He does the survey 2 years later, and we're down to about 5% of a knowledge worker's day thinking and reflecting. That should give any leader in any organization amazing amounts of pause. And people in the audiences I've spoken to say, Daniel, what is the magic number? And I said, I don't know what the magic number is. I don't know if it's 10%, 20%. But I simply know that when 5% of a workforce's day is spent thinking and reflecting, and when you're in the knowledge business and you're in the business of what General Petraeus described to me as hatching big ideas, and that they don't fall from a tree like the apple did on Newton's head, I think that 5% is unacceptable. So I spent a lot of time over and did a lot of interviews with leaders in academia, anthropology, sociology, economics, business, and also government. I do a lot of work with government organizations, and they are not immune to the same problem that the average business knowledge worker is facing. And I can't say that I have a silver bullet from what comes from all of my research, because my book is very much story-driven. I think that's how people learn. So I wrote a series of stories across 10 or 11 chapters, and within it is probably dozens of case studies. But a couple that I think sort of stand out to me, and I'm going to use General Petraeus as a great example. I was very curious about how General Petraeus thought through the moments of what became the surge. And the surge was, we're going back to 2006 here in Iraq, when there is fundamentally a huge disconnect. We are losing that war. And everyone knows about whether or not we should be in there politically or not, everyone knows about what happened after the surge happened. That violence went up dramatically and then fell off the cliff, and Iraq certainly far from being a stable democracy. It went from a dangerous edge and pulled back from the edge. And what made me curious about that was not so much the surge itself, but I knew that there had to be some incredible thinking that had been done prior to that, particularly after we were doing it wrong for so many years, not just in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. And when I peeled the onion back there, I got to spend time with not just General Petraeus, but also his Marine Corps counterpart, General James Mattis. And both of these war fighters were in theater in Iraq in multiple tours of duty. General Mattis actually led the ground invasion of Iraq. General Petraeus, of course, does 3 tours of duty before he finally gets tapped by President Bush to go and fix what looked like a very unwinnable situation. And when you peel that onion back, what I was amazed to discover was where these two men were when they did the pre-thinking before the surge. And they found themselves in Leavenworth, Kansas, they found themselves out at the Combined Army Knowledge Center, which is where General Petraeus was at the time. And he was in charge of literally trying to come to grips with what was the Army learning and what was it coming to grips with. And we talk about information overload. The warfighter today throws off more data than any war fighter in history. We have this concept of commander-centric warfare and previously called network-centric warfare. And in the midst of all that data, we're getting fundamentally the big ideas wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I stepped back and watched what Petraeus did, he not only rewrote the counterinsurgency manual in a period of about 7 months that I described in detail in about a 9,000-word chapter in the book, but it was who he brought into the room to think with that I think is a great example for others to emulate in this age of information overload. And that is to bring in people who are atypical. To bring in people, for example, he brought in folks from the Vietnam era, and there we have lots of different conclusions about what happened in Vietnam and whether or not that was a counterinsurgency. But he brought in one particular audience that really captivated me. It was the human rights community. And I could not believe the video, because I was the first scholar to ever request the actual audio and videotapes of these vetting conferences that happened across days, in which in that 7-month period the counterinsurgency doctrine was rewritten. He vetted it in front of groups of people of up to 200 folks at a time. And there's Petraeus sitting in the front row. And you have folks from the human rights community. This is post-Abu Ghraib, by the way. And not only are they in the room and given a voice, but they're not shouted down. And in fact, actually, they're vocally encouraged to offer their debate and their dissent. And so if I was to offer one great insight, I think, from the book that I covered many different angles, it's that in an age in which we're not thinking and reflecting anywhere near what I think organizations need to be. We're still in survival mode. We're still coming to grips with what the economic reset means to all of our organization, and change is an absolute constant. But I think it's going to be those companies and organizations that figure out how to bring into rooms and structure debate and dialogue and to encourage dissent and to hear from your most vocal critics, not the day that you go live with the new product or service and not the day that you go live with the next big idea and you hope that it happens, but to have the courage to allow them into the room, because there is a chance to collaborate and to think different, not to get into groupthink, but to get into what I described in the book, and Joe Raylan gave me the language to describe as group reflection. And it is so rare.
1 minute warning.
There you go. So I'm actually going to just sort of wrap it up from there, because it's a pretty powerful example of the idea of group reflection, in the sense that when a group comes together and you have this overhang of information just pounding into each person in that room, you have these Pavlovian urges that we have to control in terms of the technology, and we have to come to grips with the idea that we can't multitask. Let's assume we get past all that and you're in the room. Is how leaders structure those conversations, what the inputs are to them today, who's in the room, and whether or not there is the notion of dialogue, that I think is the great transcendent moment that can happen for leaders and organizations today. And I'm sure we'll hit on that a little bit more as the conversation goes on. Thanks again, Jonathan, for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
Great. Well, Daniel, thank you very much. I can very much recall how I wish I'd seen your face, because we were doing this by phone, but when I told you that the number had actually, in our most up-to-date research, changed from 12% to 5% of the knowledge workers' day in terms of the amount of time left for thought and reflection, I still remember the almost horror in your voice that, and I know how much you care about this. Our next author is Maggie Jackson, author of Distracted. I just wanted to add a personal comment about Maggie, because in this virtual world we live in, and Maggie was one of the first people to really write in depth about the overall topic relating to information overload, and we spoke many times over the course of many years, and her articles in the Boston Globe were widely read and highly regarded. So the first time we met in person, which was at a meeting at Columbia University, I was quite surprised that she lived in Manhattan as opposed to in Boston. Somehow I just pictured her in Boston writing for the Boston Globe, but that was a little bit of a sense of reality in terms of how our virtual world can collide with the real world. So Maggie, if I can turn the mic over to you.
Okay, great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for having me here and for doing this. And it is a pleasure for me to be in the virtual room with some great thinkers who are attacking this issue in so many different ways, using so many different languages, which I think is a really creative and important way to understand and then also push back on this problem of overload and problem of lack of reflection and multitasking and everything we're talking about today. So why did I write the book? Well, as a columnist and a writer, I had been writing about technology's impact on our lives for many years. And I began to notice that especially people were seemingly more controlled by their technology than vice versa. You know, they were reacting, jumping to every beep and ping in their lives, and they truly felt a lack of a sense of control in their lives, and that caught my eye. Even back in 2004, 60% of workers said they felt busier than ever, but felt like they were getting less done. And, you know, in my own life, I would rush my kids to bed, 2 kids to bed, and then hurry back to the laptop in the evenings, and life had really changed. So at first I thought I was going to write a book about the first ever technology revolution, the invention of the cinema, the telegraph, the telephone, and all of the gadgets and gizmos that changed our lives in the Industrial Revolution. So I went looking for historical clues to how we could adapt to the iPods and the BlackBerries. Well, I didn't get very far there, but I did have an epiphany, really. I sat in a library one day, and I actually, in the middle of neck-deep in history research, came to the epiphany that really the issue was attention, that the Industrial Revolution set off changes in how we experience time and space that are still unfolding, the shattered distance, layered moments, etc., but it all has been changing how we manage attention. So that's what I felt we needed to grapple with. So my book explores the impact of our culture of distraction, basically, on our lives. You know, we have abundant connectivity, as we're all talking about. You know, we have tsunamis of weak ties. So many people in our lives, but now even our most intimate relationships are being carried out using the most thinnest, faceless means of communications media ever invented. And then in the parallel, we have, of course, loads of data assaulting us every day. But you know, I began to ask and research, do we have the frameworks and also, as William James said, the habits of mind that we need to turn this data into wisdom? So how can we go deeply when we're scattered, hurried, and distracted? And that was really the question that I've tried to tackle in the book. And in particular, I also wanted to know, you know, I wanted to take a big picture look back, step back, and take perspective in a bigger way, because I felt that this is not just an issue for individuals, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it was an issue for our society. And I became convinced, and there are a lot of other incredibly brilliant people talking about the same thing, Harold Bloom, Umberto Eco, Jane Jacobs, you know, that they were all talking about a dark age. And here we are, you know, bandying about the terminology, information age, digital age, you know. A, were we really at the turning point in our society? And B, was it really a darker time? And I argue in the book, and I think it's, you know, very much the evidence has mounted in the years since I've been doing this research, that indeed we're, you know, unless we take hold of this problem, that we do risk a dark age. Because a dark age, as my historical research showed me, is not a time of, you know, a collection of subtractions, as Jane Jacobs said, but it's really both, historically speaking, often a technologically inventive time, but a time of accumulated losses. So, you know, when listening is becoming kind of a dying art, when relationships, many people would argue, are increasingly autistic, when work is boundaryless, I think, and increasingly we're losing the skills we need for deeper thinking just at the time when we need them, you know, that says to me that we risk a dark age by many people's definition. So what can we do? I want to talk a little bit about, you know, attention as a way to tackle information overload. You know, first, I think in order to understand what it is we're squandering here, what is it that we hunger for when we hunger for focus, we really have to understand attention. And there's been an explosion of research into this topic in recent years, how it develops, how it's, you know, the mechanics of its development in children, how it works, how it operates. And I think we need to get this research into schools, into workplaces, even around the dinner table. We need to speak a language of attention. Interestingly enough, neuroscientists now say that attention isn't a single thing. Now, I just said it, but actually it's plural. There are 3 main types of attention scientists have just discovered. And attention is an organ system, by the way. It's like your digestive or your circulatory system, in that it's a highly complex faculty that draws on the combination of the brain and many different body parts in order to function. So first of all, when we talk about attention, we're talking about focus. We understand that. Focus is what you need to have, what you need to give to a partner if the relationship is going to work. Focus is what you need to draw on if you're going to score the exam. And focus is the spotlight of your attention, concentration. Now secondly, there's awareness. Or scientists say alerting. That's wakefulness or sensitivity to your surroundings. And that's, you might think of that as the kind of court sense you need when you're playing basketball to, know where the other team is and score the point. And finally, there's executive attention, which is kind of the symphony conductor of your mind. It allows you to plan and judge and particularly to resolve conflicting information. So we're dealing with a number of arrows in a quiver. And the headline news, though, the most important takeaway here is that attention can be trained or shaped. Now, we know the brain is plastic. We're not a package of jeans. The environment shapes us. But the important and double-edged nature of attention is that you can put a person into a noisy, interrupt-driven, distractible environment, and you are actually shaping that person to be a distracted person. On the flip side, with training, with the right environment, people can become attentional athletes. And I use that term, attentional athletes, from a psychiatrist who works in Texas with children with attention problems. And I think it's a wonderful term for what we need to be moving toward. So again, what can we do? If we know about attention, how can we take these arrows in our quiver and use them? That's the other kind of part of the book part of the problem that I tried to tackle in my book. First of all, I think what's really important beyond individual habits, etc., and what's very important to recognize that this is a collective social task. We didn't green the environment by changing our own trash habits alone. We got together and we're working on this in a collective way. I see the same challenge as far as attention and overload. We need to make sure that we create, for instance, values related to attention. We need to understand, what if we question that the first hand up in the American classroom is not always the smart kid? Or what if we question that the business person with their nose down in the BlackBerry at all times, hardly listening to anybody around them, is a success story in this country? These are values related to attention. And in the industrial age, I might add, because people were moving from the agrarian or craftsman's-like style of living into bureaucracies for the first time, rigid focus was, venerated. Now we've moved to the opposite end of the pendulum, where we think that splintered, scattered attention, multitasking, etc., is the ticket, the cognitive booster rocket. Now, of course, I'm not saying we need to throw out multitasking or skimming or surfing at all, but we also need to value focus and quiet time and uninterrupted living in part. So it's really important to understand the value system related to attention. And our second environmental challenge, and my second suggestion would be to set the stage for focus, to literally think of this as an environmental issue in terms of refashioning our experience of time and space. Draw the boundaries back that we've lost, even if it's just around the supper table or around a part of your vacation or around the Bill Gates kind of retreat. Have uninterrupted social moments. Don't let the clock dictate your relationships. Recover, Nathan Zeldis from IORG talked about the meaning of minds that meetings used to be. So these are collective social environmental tasks. IBM has Think Fridays, which has really, allowed people to harness focus in ways that they'd like. And then lastly, I'll just close by saying, If distraction scatters you and diffuses you, and that actually is several hundred-year-old definition of distraction, to be scattered. We now think of it as to be pulled away to something secondary, but it used to mean to be pulled in pieces. You can find that reference in Shakespeare, which is, I think, really apropos for the way we live today. And attention, on the other hand, comes from the Latin ad tendere. It means to stretch toward. It's a means to an end. So the question is, attention to what? Attention to what once we harness focus again? I would suggest that the starting point has to be attention to others. That really has to be the starting point. I mean, we can have all the connections in the world, but unless we acknowledge each other, listen deeply, focus on one another, they don't count. And the same with data and depth of mind. So I think that everybody gives, moment to moment, their attention to what seems worthy of, their attentional capabilities. Everybody is spending their attention day to day, and we don't get these moments back. And I think that giving the gift of attention really should be the starting point.
Thank you, Maggie. As you mentioned, the businessman with his head down in the BlackBerry, it made me think of the statistic over the past 4 years that emergency room admissions for people who have walked into lampposts have doubled each year in the past 4 years.
In fact, distracted pedestrians are now the subject of some legislative efforts, at least I know in New York State, so that pedestrians have to take responsibility for paying attention to their surroundings.
That should be interesting. Well, I'd like to now introduce William Powers, author of Hamlet's BlackBerry. For those of you who didn't realize, Hamlet walked around with one also. He'll explain. Bill?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think I'm the only one on the telephone. Can you all hear me?
You're great. Coming in
great.
perfectly.
Okay, thank you.
I'm on a phone too, by the way. I'm using the. I literally dialed in.
Oh, great. Okay, that's what I did. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm also really delighted to be here and honored to be sharing this panel with people who've done such great work. And I've sat here taking furious notes. I've learned so much just in the last half hour from what my predecessors have said, so thank you for all that wisdom. My book, just to answer the first question about where it began, my book grew out of what had been my career as a journalist, where I had been for many years at the Washington Post and at several magazines a media critic, and really focused for most of that time on the content of the media. So is the New York Times doing a good job on such and such story? Did CBS cover that earthquake well? It was all about the content. And it began to dawn on me in the late 90s and after the turn of the century that that Marshall McLuhan was right, that the story in the digital age wasn't so much about the content, but about the devices themselves, that the medium was increasingly what was changing our lives for better in many ways, but also as time went on, I began to feel and notice that it was changing our lives for the worse. And I began to see a lot of studies coming out, sort of ethnographic studies about how much time people were spending with screens of various kinds, and they were rising very quickly, and that was a bit troubling to me. The numbers on ADHD, people suffering from what Dave said he suffered from, were also shocking. And I began to see the very early work that Jonathan, you had been doing and others have been doing, really picking up on this thread very early, that there's a problem out there in the workplace in productivity and that people aren't paying enough attention to it, and we need to. And so I got interested in all of this, and on top of all of that observational stuff, I was noticing it in a very personal way in my life, in my work life, where I was personally having trouble getting the kind of focus that Maggie talked about, having trouble even staying with a good novel, which used to be one of my great thrills, and suddenly I found I couldn't do it anymore. 2 pages and I'd be rushing off to check the screen. I also was finding it in my relationships, in my family life. I had a young son at the time who was 6 or 7 when I started to really feel this, and my wife and I noticed we were sort of not paying attention to each other the way we used to. We were losing eye contact. We were kind of abandoning each other after dinner for our respective screens, and that troubled me. So I sort of put all this together, and I really wanted to do a project about it, write about it. There wasn't really a good platform for me to do it in my day-to-day work job, which was really about what was happening that week. And out of the blue, I had a chance to spend a semester as a fellow at Harvard's Shorenstein Center, which is all about the media, studying any question I wanted. It was this incredible golden invitation. And I decided to look at one little narrow piece of this question, the tools question, which is paper. Is it really true that paper, the hard copy tool for reading and for communicating, is about to become obsolete? And I felt that that question might lead me to more revelations and possibly epiphanies about the larger question of what do we do about life in a connected world. So I did that essay. I won't take up time here describing what I concluded, but basically I actually decided that paper has a future because we are having trouble with focus, and a disconnected medium that has been incredibly successful for over 2,000 years may actually continue to help us focus in some way going forward because it's not part of the electronic grid and part of all these distractions. That essay got some attention, and I got some offers to write a book, and I decided to expand it and actually to really not write about paper at all, but to look at the broader question that was troubling me about basically how to manage life, what is this problem about, and how to intelligently manage our lives in this world of so many distractions and so many interruptions and so many switches, as Dave said. And basically, can I help people figure this out? So what I do in the book is I concluded going into my project, my book project, that the one thing that I really was craving, lots of people were offering really helpful, practical ideas, but what I was craving was a kind of overarching philosophy that I could carry around with me in my head. You know, the problem is essentially in our minds, and I really felt that the solution could be something that we could tuck away in our minds as a handy way of thinking about this that we could apply to any situation. And the way I try and form that philosophy in my book is that I go back into the past. Maggie talked about how she had done some of that in her research, and I did that as well. I went back to a number of moments in history that I had long been aware of when human beings faced a challenge similar to this one, when technologies came along that filled up suddenly life with all kinds of new connectedness, information, opportunities to learn and interchange and so forth, but also imposed new burdens. And at each of those moments, I focused on some really smart person who had some interesting perspective on it, one of which is Shakespeare. And there is indeed a moment in Hamlet where Hamlet uses a device that was, in fact, basically the BlackBerry of his time. It was an erasable tablet with a stylus that was something that people found incredibly useful in the time when they were trying to manage the overload of print. And it was a device that actually helped people with that challenge, which I think is kind of inspiring for our time and for technologists today that they might learn from. Some of the other points in history, I focused more on people's ability, the way people learn to open up what I call gaps between themselves and their connected lives. Not their digital lives, because none of these periods I looked at were digital periods, but the parallels are quite amazing. And the practical advice that I got from some of these people, as unlikely candidates as Henry David Thoreau, who you would think would have nothing to tell us about life in the modern age because he's thought of as a technophobe. But he actually wasn't a technophobe. He was someone who was just trying to strike a healthier balance in his life and open up one of these gaps between himself and all that busyness of the telegraph and railroad era so he could have quiet time, have the kind of reflective time that we're talking about today. I take all these lessons in the book and I basically try to apply them to everyday life. And that's sort of the back part of my book. The last third of it is about what can we do with this wisdom that we've picked up from these philosophers from the past, and what is this new philosophy that we can embrace today? And it basically comes down to the idea of balance. We can all strike a healthier balance if we realize that there is a lot to be gained from striking a healthier balance. And if we come into this with a philosophy not of maximum connectedness, but of balancing our connectedness, we will reap all kinds of benefits. So I talk in the latter part of the book about striking this balance through opening up gaps of time or boundaries of time, and I talk about organizations that have done that. In particular, I draw on Jonathan's own research about the Intel Corporation and some fascinating experiments they have done. I look at opening up boundaries of space. In particular, I talk about sort of doing what Thoreau did, but in our own homes and offices where we have spaces that are set aside for being disconnected, for not being with our devices. I call them Walden zones. And finally, at certain points in the latter part of the book, I talk about the idea that technology might evolve so it can help us open up these kinds of gaps I'm talking about. And there are a couple of very interesting schools of thought about where technology might go to give us more control and more of a sense of ability to open up these distances that I'm talking about, but I don't really have time to go into those. But basically, it's the idea that we can have a new philosophy today drawing on the philosophy of the past. And in fact, writing this book left me very optimistic that we're going to be able to do that. We have been through this before, is one of my real messages in Hamlet's BlackBerry, and we can do it again. And I think we're on our way, and in fact, I think this panel is a wonderful example of how on our way we are. So that's sort of my summary, and thanks again for having me.
Bill, thank you very, very much. I've started to sometimes use your term with attribution, of course, of Walden zones. I think that's very appropriate as we try and find a way of escaping from our connected lives. So I suppose it's now up to me to answer the questions that I devised for the other four eminent authors here on the panel. And I just want to first stop, and I want to thank them for taking the time out of their overloaded lives to spend this hour and a half with us today, and also to thank the audience as well, because we recognize how precious each moment is when 5% of the day is left for thought and reflection. As to my own book, that comes out of my background for the past 20 years, studying how knowledge workers, and there are 78.6 million of them, work, how we collaborate, how we share information, what we do with that information, and why sometimes things don't quite go as planned, and the problems that ensue when things don't go as planned started to lead me down the path of information overload related issues. I didn't really use the term information overload that much early on, but I can see in hindsight it was kind of a projectile going towards that. We started to recognize, and when we were doing research in 2003, 2004 timeframe, that there was a very, very interesting phenomenon that was occurring. We really had to go and study this more because it was so interesting. It was what we eventually named recovery time, which is the time after an interruption that it takes the knowledge worker to get back to where he was before the interruption. Now, that's not merely just to resume what he or she was doing, but rather to regain the flow of where he was at that particular point. And that's very key, because the astounding number that we came up with was that it takes the knowledge worker 10 to 20 times the amount of the interruption to come back to this point, if he or she comes back at all. So to put that into practice, a 30-second interruption could result in 5 minutes or more of recovery time. Now, just to be clear, you don't really sit and say, oh, I'm going to stop my recovery time right now, and let's see. Okay, recovery time is almost up. I should be able to resume this any moment. No, this is, excuse me, all so insidious. In the book, I refer to this as death by 1,000 paper cuts. You don't really feel it, and there are so many little interruptions throughout the day that it's just a question of it all adding up. So that's the same reason that if in an organization you CC 100 extra people unnecessarily on an email, which makes them stop, look at the email, and then try to resume, you lose about 8 man-hours total time for those 100 people and those 100 extra emails. So with recovery time, we were able to start to assign actual dollar values to the cost of information overload. And that's where it really got interesting, because until the point, and I think the first time we assigned a dollar value to any of this was around 2003, until that point, it was kind of interesting, but not too many people were paying attention. Once we assigned dollar values, and the first value we assigned was $588 billion for unnecessary interruptions and recovery time, but we've revised that subsequently since, so please don't use that. All of a sudden, similar to the signs at McDonald's which say billions and billions served, where they used to update them, but they gave up after a while, people were paying attention and saying, oh my God, this is costing us a fortune. But no one really sat down and added up, how much does this actually cost us for my organization? No one did the sort of back-of-the-napkin calculation saying, well, if I'm actually losing, and ultimately it was 20 or 25% of the day, and all my knowledge workers are losing this, well, what's it costing my organization? So this is kind of the driving force of a lot of my thinking in putting the book together. And, of course, I saw all these people having fun with their books, and it was great to work with everyone in that regard. So I said, well, it's just time to write a book, and that's the genesis of the book. Now, switching gears for a moment, in terms of the issues out there, and it's interesting because I think all of us, to some extent or another, have looked at this from a quasi-historical point of view. I realized after completing the timeline, which is in the early section in the book, that I had gone from the clay tablet to the iPad tablet, literally in the timeline. And that shows us how much we've gone. And, of course, Bill just mentioned, the Hamlet's tablet. So just to throw out a few statistics, I mentioned that there are 78.6 million knowledge workers, and that's in the U.S. alone. We estimated that for 2010, information overload cost the U.S. economy approximately $1 trillion, $997 billion to be exact. And along with that, approximately 28 billion hours are lost each year. And that's where most of the $997 billion cost comes from. If you get 100 emails a day, reading and processing those 100 emails can occupy half the day. It's amazing how much time this all takes. We found that in surveys we did, 66% of knowledge workers felt they simply don't have enough time to get all of their work done. But the statistic that stuck with me the most is that 94% of the knowledge workers we surveyed at some point have felt overwhelmed by information to the point of incapacitation. 94%. Let me repeat that once more. 94%. That's an incredible number. This is the appropriate time, if this were a live audience, for me to say, okay, here's where you say ooh and ah. That's an ooh-ah moment. If you think about it, information overload causes people to lose their ability to manage their thoughts, their ideas, clearly rules out any time for contemplation, and the time that you need to reason and think is simply not there. It's only 5%. We do things backwards. Many things that could be done by a simpler means we do by email. Email exchanges can go on for days and weeks at a time. I found that sometimes the simplest thing is a 5-minute phone call, and that seems to resolve a matter. Sometimes you sort of, I'm sure a lot of you here have noticed this. You see an email going and going and going, and you say, well, this is just going to go on forever. I'm going to need to pick up the phone. That's simply, one way of doing it. And most importantly, information overload has resulted in work days that, well, they never really seem to end. We've pretty much decimated what remained of work-life balance. And a lot of this comes, by the way, because we really don't have a management science applicable to the knowledge economy and information age. If you think about it, it took 150 years from the dawn of the industrial age until the point at which we had developed the beginnings of a management science for the industrial age. Now we're in, depending on how you count, where the start of the knowledge economy and information age might be, somewhere anywhere between year 25 and 40, and it's way too early for us to have a really robust management science for the information age. So what we do is we borrow the management science from the industrial age, and that's very much like putting a square peg into a round hole. So what do I think we should do about this? Mostly, I think, if I can impart one thought to you, it's the following. Keep in mind that we are our own worst enemy. In fact, I co-authored a paper a few years ago, Information Overload, We Have Met the Enemy and He Is Us. All of our actions, whether we decide to CC a couple of hundred extra people in an email, whether we send an email and 2 minutes later call a person and say, hey, did you get my email? There are lots of different reasons that I simply don't have the time to go into, but all of these activities wreak havoc on others' lives. Yet we blithely go through our lives not recognizing the impact that our tiny little actions have, which could be enormous. So I would ask that you take a moment actually to think and reflect about this and consider when you're sending emails, consider when you're thinking about following up 2 minutes later with an instant message or phone call. Consider all of these things and consider, is it really that urgent and important? I really think we've lost our sense of urgency and importance over the past 20 years. I have a chapter called The Two Freds in my book that really goes into that, but I won't dwell on that. It's something we have to really think about, and if we each take individual responsibility for our actions and just start to do things with others in mind, maybe others will get the message as well. With that, I'm going to tell myself that I've used up my 8 minutes, and I'm going to now come back to our panel and invite our panel to engage in some discussion, and then we'll open up for general Q&A. Panelists, are you all there, mic'd on, etc.?
Yes.
Bill, Maggie, Dave?
Ready.
Okay, great. Who would like to volley the first question or a discussion point or a comment or anything? All yours.
Could I say something?
Yeah, please. Just say.
This is Bill.
Bill, that's you.
Hi, Jonathan. I just wanted to pick up on your very last comment about doing things with others in mind, which is such a wonderful thought. So many people who do these really broad studies like you do don't wind up taking it down to the individual human level, and you always do that in your work, which I really appreciate, and you did it today. And I wanted to ask you and anyone else who might want to chime in, do you think these devices are moving us away from actually keeping others in mind when they're in fact supposed to be connecting us more closely? Are we becoming less emotionally intelligent, less empathetic as we move forward? And if so, is there a way to reverse that?
By these devices, I'm assuming you mean the tablets and the smartphones beyond
the whole
just
thing,
the
yeah.
computers. The whole ball of wax, as they say.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the devices. I think, in part, I'd like to reference a white paper that a Swiss novelist, Rolf Dobelli, wrote. And without going too deep into what Rolf wrote, essentially he has put forth a very, very good argument that our constant input, the constant input of tiny news fragments, is dulling our brains. I think, Bill, it was you who commented that you couldn't read more than a page or two of a good book without feeling a need to go to a screen. What Dobelli is pointing out is that we not only have become news junkies, but we've become accustomed to getting these tiny sound bites, essentially. And that has perhaps changed our ability to be able to digest deeper, more in-depth work. And I started not actually having read Dobelli, but through a combination of factors. At the beginning of the year, I started cutting back on my intake of news. And I found that I was much more able to focus, having stopped taking in all these little bits and pieces of news. Let me turn this over to the other panelists.
It's Maggie. I'd like to say a couple points on that because that's was a core facet of what I was trying to wrestle with my book. And I would say definitely that I don't think the trend is good in this way. In terms of the way our gadgets are shaping our social sensitivity, the three things I have in mind. First of all, the space of connection is very often virtual, as I mentioned. increasingly. You used to be able to look at the Pew Research and see that teenagers, for instance, who are so rabidly social, it used to be about neck and neck, that they would be face-to-face with each other and then virtually together. Now the balance is tipping. Their relationships are being carried out virtually, as you can see. So the space of connection is thinner and faceless. That changes the ground rules right there. Second, when you have a moment of togetherness, it's very often interrupted. So that changes, that pierces and removes what I call the integrity of the moment. That's a huge impact right there. And then finally, our emphasis, again, the value system, the emphasis on the quick means that we expect instantaneous results even in relationships. You know, for instance, in the virtual realm, there's something called optionality, which changes executive recruiting, online dating. You know, something's awkward, you can click away. You can find someone else. And you're not staying within the limits of humanity, which our biology and psychology and philosophy teach us that we have. You think that you're able to surpass the limits of being a human being. Well, this road leads to me to the idea that we can be robotic. And I know that's a pretty perhaps dark assessment, but I truly am worried about this.
I just want to jump in. This is Jonathan for 1 second. There were two things that I long ago started to reference as to why we act this way. And it's a combination of a sense of entitlement that's developed and perhaps been greatly blown out of proportion, and an increasing need for instant gratification. In the chapter I referenced before, the two Freds, which referenced Fred Smith and Fred Rogers, I felt that a good starting point for our need for instant gratification was the development of FedEx as an overnight concept. Today, of course, if we order something and the product is not on our desks by 10:30 the next morning, we are frantically tracking the trucks every moment, every movement on the web, and so on and so forth. But the sense of entitlement is equally bad. In the past 20 or so years, a lot of people have grown up with a feeling that they are not only special, but entitled to, well, God knows what. The deadly combination here, though, results in workers who feel no compunction whatsoever about sending you an email and then barging into your office or sending you an IM or calling you 2 minutes later, because after all, what that person is doing is far more important and urgent than what you could possibly be doing. So that's kind of where I see that coming from, by the way. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Jonathan.
Yes, please.
This is Dave Crenshaw. I just want to make a comment about this. In fact, I just put a video up on my site about this. It's something that when I'm working with companies, I'm helping them do, which is transition from a culture of now to a culture of when. The culture of now, just as you said, is that entitlement. When someone calls, I need an answer now. When an email is sent, I need an answer now. And this can go on and on. What I'm helping them do is move to a situation where it's a matter of, yes, I'm going to answer every single email. Yes, I'm going to respond to every single voicemail. But yes, I'm going to answer your questions. And this is when I'm going to do it. What I've found in just working in the field is that people are very much okay with not getting a response now, as long as there is a clear when as to when they'll get that response and when they can take action on it. And that alleviates that stress. I mean, just the most simple example is on my voicemail. It says I'll return my calls at noon and at 4 o'clock. It's really interesting when I call someone back, let's say at 3:30, they will say, oh, you're calling me a half an hour earlier. So all of a sudden, they're okay with the delay because I exceeded their expectation. So a lot of this it just comes down to expectations. I don't think that technology is the problem. I think it's just the improper use of technology that's the problem.
I think that's very, very wise words from Dave Crenshaw. I would just like to point out that if you think it's bad, you should read the last chapter in my book, 2084, Our Future, which looks at information overload in the year 2084. It's, a lot changed because the information beam, which was first announced in the year 2020 and which was perfected in the 2030s, really started off a new kind of information society where I-beams were allowing every person on Earth to gain access to the total sum of human knowledge. Later on, by the way, the sleep beam was introduced in 2055, which allowed humans to assimilate information during certain sleep stages. So if you think it's bad now, just wait until every bit of human knowledge that's out there is hitting your brain all at once and see how well we do then. Panelists?
This is Daniel Forrester. Great conversation, and I'm just going to kind of pick up on the early upfront part about this, on the idea of consumption of media. And my dear friend Aldo Bello, who I quote in my book, he has referred to the time that we're living in as media snacking. And when you think about that word and what that means, and look about the habits of how we sort of scatter our days, and I'm trying not to do that anymore, the problem with snacking is you never get full, and you never quite get to the table to have a meal, which makes you realize that when you're snacking on media and you're trying to harness and hatch big ideas inside a company, that what you are giving up is context. And when you sit with leaders, and a great example that I use in the book, I got to study some of the habits of Dr. Mitchell Reese, who's the head of strategy for Colin Powell. And he revealed to me a habit of Powell's during the first 4 years when he was the head of strategy for him, in which Powell actually had downtime built into his day. This is the Secretary of State of the United States in the context of post 9/11 with 2 wars. And Reese looks up and discovers that on Powell's schedule are literally hours of the day in which he's reading and reflecting and assimilating. And what is he doing there? He's attempting to bring context into conversations that I'm not going to get into a political discussion here of how the previous administration did its thing, but debate and dissent were, there's not a lot of evidence that that was the case. And a Secretary of State or an assistant to a CEO or even the head of a division, you owe it to yourselves and to the leaders today to come into the rooms by not snacking on media, but by offering context. And if you don't, when you get called on in the room and you're only able to offer a pithy, almost non-sequitur to the conversation, or even don't offer pushback or debate or dissent, there's no chance that that organization is living out its potential. In fact, actually, it's the opposite of it. So I think we're living in a time where I'm increasingly discovering the death of context. And leaders today have to ask themselves, how much time are they thinking and reflecting? But also a larger conversation, which I think I'd love to hear some of the comments from the panelists on, is that I think there's a set of social contracts that are inside organizations today that are just totally flawed and completely broken. And that begins and ends, to me, with the senior executives in an organization that even have the consciousness to harness this entire conversation and ask themselves, does this entire dialogue that we've had for the last hour and a half mean anything? Or are the responses and the ebbs and the flows of how it seems to be that they're coping today, is that acceptable? Because I think everyone on this call so far that I'm listening to, the meta story is that none of us believe it's acceptable. So I just think there's this concept, and I talk a lot about it in my book, of the social contract. And I think it has to begin and end with a dialogue at the senior-most executives, and then they got to lead from the top. Because in each organization, thinking, reflection, and dealing with information overload are going to become almost at the incremental and the individual company level, straight down to the individual. But each company will have its own interpretation, and I wonder if others would like to comment on that.
Yeah, Daniel, I love what you just said about the contract. This is Dave Crenshaw. I just spoke to a large construction company, and I was talking about creating a line in the sand and creating boundaries and creating this culture of when, and one of the members of the audience started to kind of complain and say, well, this is great, but this is not, I'm not capable of doing this because the expectation is there that I have to work long hours. And what was really interesting, and I apologize for the crass terminology that the person used, but it illustrates it. One of the senior members there said, I call Billy bullcrap on that. And then he and another one of the owners of the business stood up and said, if you think that this is what we believe, you're wrong. And if that's what the culture is in this company, then we need to change it. So and you could see the relief on everyone's faces when they heard from the top that they weren't expected to respond immediately, that they weren't expected to be there till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. But if those members, those senior members of management had not been in the room and not said that, you can imagine how difficult it would have been for me to convince the attendees otherwise in that moment.
Panelists, other things you'd like to discuss? Or? I just wanted to add to our audience, if you have a story about your own struggle or issue with information overload, my book actually has 2 components. You don't even have to buy the second part, although my publisher would kick me for saying that. If you go to www.overloadstories.com, and our esteemed panelists are welcome to do this as well, of course, you can add your own personal or organizational story about information overload to the stories that other readers have already contributed. We'd very much like to have as many stories as possible because I view my book as not stopping on the last page, which I found to be a kind of arbitrary distinction, but rather I view the book as completely continuing on the trajectory in the form of overloadstories.com. Now, I'd like to ask people in the audience if you have a question. You can click the raise your hand button, and I should hopefully see you if you raise your hand. I'm watching, and I should be able to unmute you, and I see there's one question already. I'm just going to give it one more moment, but let me start with, I just saw a couple of questions here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, our first question comes from, actually I don't know what the question's paying here, sorry. Not much, oh, never mind. Okay, I'm learning how to use the panel as going on. Our first question is as follows, and this is for all the panelists. What do you say to those who view information overload as simply a filter issue? Panelists? Starting to feel like I'm a game show host.
Well, I would say it depends on what you mean by the filter. Is the filter the gadget or is it the person? And I think it winds up being some combination of the two. But I think just attributing it to one word and one idea, filter, is a bit simplistic.
I'll give you I think the person who asked the question had the, Clay Shirky comment. There is no problem about information overload. It's just a filter issue in mind when that question was posed.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think, Clay's very good at many things, and one of them is the one-sentence catchy observation, and I just think that one doesn't really get at the depth of the challenge.
Yeah.
And this is Maggie. It reminds me also of some of the past thoughts that scientists had about attention, which was people focused for a long time in the research on the bottleneck question. Is there a bottleneck in how much we can digest in terms of stimuli in our environment? And yes, that is an issue. There is a bottleneck. That's one reason why multitasking is inefficient at complex levels, because you literally have to gear up and then switch tasks and then gear down, and we have these bottlenecks. But that doesn't address the entire breadth or spectrum of the challenge when it deals with multitasking as a habit, or multitasking as a cultural lifestyle, as a value system, et cetera, as a job description. So I think that's true. I think that filtering is only one question that we're dealing with when it comes to information overload. And going back to what Bill Powers said, I think that yes, we're dealing with content in terms of we have to sift through content and understand what's important and what's trivial, but we're also dealing with the way the tools shape the discussion and shape our lives. So I wouldn't agree, actually, that the tools are a non-issue here, because each tool, each medium has its own characteristics, and so therefore the tools really are part of the discussion. They're not the whole discussion, but I think the the fax is different from the telephone, is different from the telegraph, is different from Twitter, and we have to get up to speed and become more facile and understanding of what the tools do to shape us. They certainly promote speed, they promote that instant gratification, and do they promote reflection? Do they promote nuances and gray, areas of gray thought and things like that? So these are, bigger questions than just filtering. But filtering is important.
Speaking of bigger questions, the next question is, do you believe that there are general factors at play here, and is the commonly stated excuse that younger people really can multitask better than older people really a factor here? Maybe Dave should start. Maybe Dave Crenshaw should start with that one.
Yeah, you're talking my language right there. Honestly, for everyone listening to this, if you haven't read my book, The Myth of Multitasking, there's a little exercise that you can do. If you go to davecrenshaw.com/exercise, there's a video there that walks you through it. And the video illustrates the 3 effects of multitasking really quickly. And let me just make a comment. I didn't say this before. I do not view myself as the expert in multitasking. There are people who are much more intelligent, much more patient when it comes to research that I would say know more about it than I do. I view myself as the evangelist of it, where I'm trying to put it on a very practical, especially in the workplace environment. Here are some things that we can change. So here's a simple thing that you can use to convince even the most jaded teenager of the consequences of multitasking. It's a little exercise that you do, and you'll see the effects of switching costs and the switching. And there are 3 effects that are universal, regardless of whether you're 16 or you're 60 or you're male or you're female or wherever you grew up. Things take longer, you make more mistakes, and you increase your stress levels. Now, some people make the switches faster than others. I could see that there's a case that women can make switches faster than men, yet it doesn't change the fact that when they make switches, they experience those consequences. And when someone talks to me, let's say about a teenager, and they say, how can I convince my child not to do this? They're multitasking on us at the dinner table. I'll talk about it in terms of their self-interest. So I'll say, talk to them about what are they losing as a result of the multitasking. Because they don't care about, homework and stuff like that. What you can talk about is how much time could you be spending with your friends? How much better could your relationships be if you weren't multitasking? How much more time could you have to play if you weren't switching back and forth between all these things? When you put it in terms of what matters to them, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes really relevant.
I'm going to jump in. I just want to discuss an experiment I conducted. I go into a lot more detail in my single tasking chapter. But I basically copied an experiment that John Hamilton of National Public Radio did in 2008 with pianist Jacob Frosch. And I replicated the experiment. I played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and I had a friend asking me questions which got increasingly difficult. I had no problem playing the first movement as I was being asked questions about the weather. As I went into the second movement, my friend asked me questions about my childhood, and a few things I had to think about. I noticed that I kind of hesitated as I was playing, but I continued. And at the end of the second movement, before I got to the third movement, which, by the way, is really tricky, so you have to pay complete attention, I hadn't even gotten that far, and he asked me to perform a simple subtraction problem. And based on, my playing, it was clear that I had to momentarily stop just to do something as simple as 80 minus 24. So there is a lot of commonality to playing the piano and driving. Both involve pedals, both involve a certain amount of automaticity, and it would be far more dangerous to replicate that type of experiment while behind the wheel in case you run somebody over. But this, if nothing else, proved to me on a personal level that it's impossible to really multitask, and that one has to be very, very aware of what can happen when you are attempting to multitask and the impact it has on how you're actually able to perform. Panelists?
Jonathan, I'll jump in on the generational piece of this multitasking, and I think Dave hit on it really well. I think I'm watching and discovering that I'm seeing teachers at universities as well as parents today really having a hard time even giving their children or giving young adults permission to unplug. There is a narrative that sort of permeates the whole millennial generation, which is that they have been constantly connected and tethered, and technology equals access to knowledge, it equals arguably access to better jobs, and he or she who is higher tech therefore is therefore the highest performer or most likely to succeed. I think that's an interesting correlation. The most tethered is the most likely to succeed these days. Yet the audiences that I'm in front of, and I think very much of what Sherry Turkle would say on this conversation right now, I think that we have a responsibility to the next generation to simply give them permission to unplug, to remind them of what things like Bill is talking about, which is that this is not the first time in human history that a technology has been disrupted in our lives and forced a lot of attention to be moved towards another place. I closed in my book talking about a simple example of Stevens College, which is an all-girls college out in the Midwest. And the head of that school decided to have a single night in which she called it Stevens Unplugged. And she invited every one of the senior members of the class into it used to be an old chapel. It's not a religious school anymore, but it used to be. And she had them hand in their BlackBerries and unplug literally, and the BlackBerries are sitting in baskets at the end of the road. You can go online, by the way, and listen to what these young girls experienced that night. And she told them that for the first time in their lives, they were going to sit in silence for 15 minutes. And she also told them that it was okay, and that a life that does not create a distinction between plugged and unplugged is one that really isn't quite worth living in some sense. And not only has Stevens College kept it going, but it's created a bit of a narrative on the campus grounds. And I'm watching professors struggle with, do you tell the kids to shut off the laptops or not? If everything that has been said on this conference call is correct about multitasking, how in the world can you have students running Google searches while you're trying to learn something profound that is happening in our country and our world today in the knowledge centers and the great universities today? There's something really disruptive and disturbing about that I think we have to come to grips with. So I think there's a whole narrative there that has got to be affected at a generational level, and it's worthy of discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example. I started when I do in-person speaking. I basically start off asking, so how many of you have smartphones? Could you take them out and show me them, please? So everybody takes them out because almost everybody has a smartphone. Great. Could you shut them off, please? You should see the look of separation anxiety that I get when I ask people to do this. I really need to get a couple of cameras from the podium into the audience at that point, because the expressions on people's faces, you want me to turn my BlackBerry or my iPhone off? Are you kidding me? I might be disconnected. I have my second movie about information overload is coming out soon. We're just in the finishing post-production stage. And they're all great quotes, but one of the ones that's particularly profound in terms of this discussion is Matt Brezina, who's the co-founder of Zobni, which is a very useful information overload fighting tool there. And he's discussing how when he doesn't have his devices, and I'm quoting, "I feel lonely," he told me on camera. So with that, I think I know we didn't get to everyone's question, but I do want to stop on time, because that way I'm going to give everyone here 3 extra minutes for thought and reflection. I think that's the best gift we can give everyone on the conference call. I'd like to thank, once again, the panelists and my friends, Dave Crenshaw, author of The Myth of Multitasking, Daniel Forrester, author of Consider, Maggie Jackson, author of Distracted, and William Powers, author of Hamlet's BlackBerry, for joining me here today on this panel. And we would very much like you to take what we've said and run with it, and please spread the word. And if you have a story, please tell the world at overloadstories.com. And if you believe that you want to help fight information overload, you can learn more about the Information Overload Research Group, IORG, at www.iorgforum.org. So on behalf of my panelists, the board of IORG, and the world at large of knowledge workers who are suffering from information overload, I thank you very much and wish you a slightly less overloaded day. Goodbye.